So, it's the last video for this class, or at least the last video that I'm making, largely because I think I've hit the major concepts that I wanted to cover in a basic critical thinking course. But secondly, because we're going to put in new content in this class if you were in my class with me this semester. So, for example, we're going to talk about Amanda Montell's book Cultish, where she looks at basically the ways that groups come together and form identities and how that can range from relatively benign groups like CrossFit to more socially destructive groups such as like death cults. But they all use thought terminating cliches and loaded language and some other ways of controlling language. We're also going to talk about Rebecca Roach's book, For Fuck's Sake, where she talks about what makes swear words or cuss words swear words and how they cause offense and how you might separate swear words from slurs and why it's really important, especially for people who are marginalized or oppressed, to be able to cause offense to people who have more power than them. I think those are directly related to this class, but I'm not going to make videos over them. First of all, because Amanda Montell has a podcast. She's done lots of really great interviews. You can look up, just pop into YouTube, Amanda Montell Cultish, and Rebecca Roach has also been on a lot of podcasts. Shout out, I think it's Brain in a Vat podcast that I watched, where she gave a really cool interview with the normal host and with Travis Timmerman. So there's just good content out there. Nonetheless, I do want to take the opportunity to sort of wrap up the what we've talked about so far and ask you, could you pass my class? So in many of my classes, especially introductory nature like this, we will have a midterm and a final. Usually they're very close to the same exam, if not the same exam, because I want my students to come away with the core concepts. And so this could be used to study for that if you just happen to be in my in-person class and come across this particular thing. But if you are someone who's not in the class, this would be just a good review of the core concepts. So that's what we're going to try and do right now. So the first class, or the first question that I'll ask on the exam is, what's the difference between intentional and extensional definitions? What's the difference between intentional and extensional definitions? So if you want to play along at home, I will ask the question, but very quickly I will move on to the answer. The answer is this. One of the first videos was on definitions, and basically with respect to definitions and the ways that we try to make our terms basically avoid vagueness. Vagueness means there's no clear definition, and avoid ambiguity, meaning that there's multiple definitions for a term, which can sometimes lead to equivocation. Equivocation is the fallacy where we shift between the meanings of the same term in weird ways, and it affects the strength of the argument. One of the ways that we can affect all of those bad things is by just having clear definitions. And one set of definitions is via intension with an S there. And what those very often are doing is they're talking about the properties or the concept of the term. Sometimes we say it's the sense of the term or the connotation. So, for example, if we were trying to define a word like Bigfoot, one of the things that we would do is we would just start with descriptions, okay? Or if we were trying to define a word like justice, maybe we would do something like an etymology or a genealogy to look at the Latin root use or the history of the term and how it's evolved over time, something like that. But what we're doing with intentional definitions is we're trying to get the concept clear. With extensional definitions, we are clarifying the definition, but less so conceptually and more objectively, in the sense that we're trying to fix the term to objects or to classes, which are just collections of objects. And that very often, rather than the sense, we're talking about the reference, and rather than connotation, maybe we're talking about denotation. But the idea here is that we often will use something like ostension, which is pointing to examples, or creating classes and subclasses. So we're talking about this 100 objects, and maybe there's a subset of 30 or so that have this thing that we can kind of like sort them up. But extension tries to fix the meaning of a term by fixing particular objects. Now, when I brought up the example of Bigfoot, I think that this brings up a really, really important thing, that sometimes your terms can have intension without having extension, meaning we can describe the concept or the property even if no real example exists on Earth. So I often ask on my exams, what is an example of a term with intension but not extension? Now, Bigfoot is probably it's an easy one, although maybe controversial in certain areas of the country. You could go completely cynical and say something like the perfect man, right? Lots of descriptions, but whether there ever has been one, probably not. And even though it's less common, I actually do think that there can be examples of terms with extension without intention in the case of anomalous data and something like a lab science. So you know that there's this group of things that seem to behaving in the same way. They don't quite fit the trends of the data, and you do further investigations to understand what's going on there, to be able to describe the properties or the concepts that can capture what's going on in that anomalous data. So definitions: intention, talking about the concept; extension, talking about the objects. Second set of differentiations is, what's the difference between an argument and an enthymeme? What's the difference between an argument and an enthymeme? Arguments are basically things that have two things, okay? Two things, at least in the traditional way. What you do with arguments is you're trying to get to the conclusion, so that's one element, and you get to that conclusion by connecting premises or support or evidence. So you have a point that you're trying to get across, and then you have a lot of support for that point. So typically in logic, we usually just say that arguments have premises and conclusions. And ideally, in an argument, especially in logical context, we want everything to be explicit. We want to, in a sort of mathematical metaphor, show all of our work. Important definitions, clear. We signal, this is my thesis. We signal, this is my thesis because of these reasons. We want everything to be absolutely as clear as possible. We want to avoid vagueness, ambiguity, etc. Whereas enthymemes are arguments, but they lack a conclusion or a premise, or potentially both. There are basically gaps in the argument. Now, that just happens in the normal course of language because we're imperfect people. But in certain settings, and I think this is kind of an interesting point, Aristotle thought that enthymemes were really important because, or they're really important in the case of rhetoric, because whenever you are talking with someone, you don't say everything. If you say everything, it's super exhausting. You're basically like not getting to the point quickly enough. You're giving too much background information. There's something about enthymemes, when deployed correctly, that makes an argument short, sweet, and really, really having a big impact that gets the point across. Now, the downside is it doesn't make everything explicit. And if there's any problems in the assumptions or the tacit premises or the tacit values, the tacit conclusions, that can lead to a really, really big problem for what's going on in that argument. So they can be short and sweet and effective in a rhetorical context, but in a logical or theoretical context, very often you want to slow down and make everything explicit. Now, if you're a scoundrel, you will also use enthymemes because you can hide the gaps in your knowledge or your values or your definitions and the stuff that you don't exactly want to show. So it's kind of like if you ever take a portrait and there are these people who say, get my good side, it's because the good side is what you want to emphasize, and the part that is further away from the camera, you want to de-emphasize that. So you can do that with enthymemes. But largely, arguments have a conclusion and premises, and they're trying to prove some sort of point, communicate some sort of point. Enthymemes lack a conclusion or some premises or both. And there's reasons in context for deploying either. Okay. This leads to just some technical terms. As far as you will run into these in most logic courses, probably almost every logic course, to be honest. And the question is, what are the two main ways that logicians assess deductive arguments? So the two main ways that logicians assess deductive arguments, what are they? And the big ways of assessing these arguments are validity and soundness. So logicians will start first and foremost with validity, which is a sort of formal assessment of an argument to make sure that the pieces fit in the right way. So as we said previously, arguments have a conclusion and premises. Validity basically says that when an argument is valid, the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. The conclusion follows necessarily from the premises. In other words, if all of the premises were true, the conclusion would be guaranteed to be true. And that's because all of the ideas are connected so strongly together that the thing that you're trying to prove just automatically follows from all of the premises, the support, the evidence that you've offered. So in deductive arguments, this is a relationship of necessity. If you have set up your connectives right, if you have made your argument as tight and logically rigorous as possible, your premises will necessarily or always lead to your conclusion. That's just how validity works in formal logical systems. In inductive arguments, so science is a good example of this, whereas deductive arguments, more usually it's geometry or math or logic. But in science, rather than validity, we often test for strength. So in a strong argument, your conclusion is highly probable given the premises or the support or the evidence. In a weak argument in inductive logic, the idea is that the conclusion is improbable based on the premises or the evidence that you've offered. So that first concern for validity or for strength in inductive arguments, deductive validity or inductive strength, is a formal requirement, or it's a formal way of assessing whether the conclusion connects to the premises. The second way is soundness. So soundness is, in deductive arguments, validity plus all true premises. So rather than just evaluating the form, we've gotten the formal assessment done in the validity. But now we can look at the content of the individual premises. We can sort of see whether every individual idea is actually right. So whenever we're assessing for validity, we don't have to basically make any judgment about whether what our opponent is saying is right or wrong, or whether what we're saying is right or wrong if we're scrutinizing our own arguments. Rather, what we're doing is just seeing if there's a connection. Once we agree that there's no breaks in the chain of logic, then we can start to look at each individual link and ask whether it's true or not. In inductive arguments, again, deductive being something like math, logic, geometry, inductive being something like science, human behavior, etc., politics, you are looking for cogency. So cogency requires that there is a strong connection between the premises and the conclusion, and it seems like most of the ideas are true. Okay. Now, this is related to very closely the idea of a formal fallacy. And a formal fallacy is a mistake in the logic that renders the argument invalid. A mistake in the argument that renders the argument invalid. And the reason why that's bad is if it's not valid, it can't be sound. Soundness requires validity plus true premises. But it's basically just formal fallacies create arguments with gaps in them, holes in them. Enthymemes very often are invalid because the connections aren't explicitly stated. Now, in logic, like I said, or in analytic context or context where you're really trying to make sure that everything is rigorously and clearly defined and argued for, that is something you want to avoid. In other rhetorical contexts, maybe it's something that you want to change or manipulate. So validity, again, is a formal assessment, and it basically says that the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises, and soundness is validity plus all true premises. Formal fallacies are basically mistakes that render an argument invalid. Okay. Now, my class, as you've seen in these videos, includes a fair amount of maybe pop psychology, but I do that because I think it really does help us to explain a lot of what's going on. It's why I pretty consistently assign David McRaney's book, You Are Not So Smart, because I think it's a really brilliant introduction to a lot of core concepts in cognitive psychology, in logic, in argumentation, rhetoric, that kind of stuff. But the ones that I choose to test over are kind of the big umbrella terms or the most important ones. And for me, I narrow that down to four of dozens that we talk about over the course of class. Sorry. And probably many that we've talked about in these videos. And so I ask especially for my students to know what apophenia, heuristics, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and confirmation bias are. So could you, off the top of your head, define apophenia, heuristics, the Dunning-Kruger effect, and confirmation bias? So the first couple are just kind of like talking about how we do stuff. Heuristic is the easy one. It's a mental shortcut. And I usually, as you saw in the videos, talk about this because there's that Kahneman system 1, system 2 type differentiation that we can talk about with respect to the way that we think. But the idea there is that our brain takes a lot of energy to run. And most often, we're just operating in a sort of automatic, maybe autopilot kind of way. It takes some intention, it takes some slowing down to basically break every idea down and ask questions and not assume that we know what's going on. Heuristics are things that happen in our brains or in patterns that basically conserve energy, so we don't have to slow down and really, really think. And they help us to be right many times. Now that's bad because it can bias us in bad ways. Even if metabolically as an individual, it might be important because I don't have to slow down. Now, one example or something that relates to that is just this broad category of things called apophenia. And apophenia is the idea that there's a general tendency in humans to connect unrelated ideas and to see them as meaningful. Your brain is a pattern machine. It just finds patterns. And apophenia has a lot of different instances that we can kind of talk about. One is pareidolia. And pareidolia, even if you don't know the term, is something that I think most people know because when they were kids, and maybe now that you're adults, you still kind of like do the same thing. But you look at the clouds. What does that cloud look like? Or maybe you look at the stars and you try and figure out the constellations or whatever else. Pareidolia is just the way in which maybe we burn our toast in a weird way and it looks like we see an image there. Our brains are pretty good at finding faces and things. And similarly, the gambler's fallacy is evidence of it, and this is a little bit more destructive in certain contexts. Spins of a roulette wheel are completely unrelated, and yet there are cases where casinos make a lot of money because the wheel randomly ends up on black a few times or red a few times, and people keep betting or betting against that particular streak. Now, realistically, those things are completely unrelated. But because our brain can't help but find patterns, we will kind of bet on those patterns, even if logically it can be very easily shown that they're independent events. Okay? So apophenia, just the general tendency to connect unrelated ideas or things and see them as meaningful. And a heuristic is just a mental shortcut. And it's a mental shortcut that helps us to not slow down, to just do things in a metabolically or maybe a temporally efficient way. We don't have to spend energy. We don't have to spend time. Now, these two are kind of interesting because I think that it's really important. There's a very ancient maxim which says, know thyself. Know thyself. It's one of the hardest things to figure yourself out, to figure out what motivates you, to know what you know, to know what you don't know, where the gaps in your knowledge are. And so I definitely try to emphasize these two lessons because I think these are so crucially important. The Dunning-Kruger effect and confirmation bias. The Dunning-Kruger effect, of course, is a very famous psychological study. And as I said, whenever we talked about it in the video, certain people have said that that's overblown. It's a statistical anomaly. I think that there's too much evidence with lots of instances of the experiments to where I don't think that it's a statistical anomaly. Nonetheless, it is at the very least anecdotally something that we should be aware of because it says that incompetent people tend to overestimate their own skill and competent people, so people who are good at the skill, tend to underestimate their own skill and overestimate the skill of others. So there's a lot of elements to this. I mean, I think this is really interesting. Bertrand Russell has the famous quote where he says that, one of the fundamental problems with the world is that the stupid are just so cocksure while the intelligent are so full of doubts. I think we often feel that way. Maybe we should feel skeptical because we want to identify as the intelligent and not the stupid, even though the Dunning-Kruger is basically saying there are many contexts probably whenever we're stupid. And by the way, expertise in one domain does not transfer to another domain. So just because I might be an expert, say, in ethics, I am not an expert in, say, even in philosophy, like metaphysics or philosophy of language, much less in psychology, much less in biology, whatever else. So expertise doesn't go across. So just because someone has an MD doesn't mean that they're really good at lab science. Just because someone has a PhD in chemistry doesn't mean that they will be able to have really good political opinions or something like that, right? But the Dunning-Kruger effect is really interesting because the incompetent people, they overestimate how good they are, but very often they do it in this way that I think is really human, which is they see themselves as just above average, just above the midpoint. So it's not a case of hubris. It's not like they're saying that they're the best of the best. They're just saying that they're slightly above average, but they're really abysmal. And that's what makes the big disparity. And competent people with the skill, underestimate their own skills because they kind of assume that a lot of people are basically on their level. And that's just not the case. So I think that that's really important to think about. It's really important to think about, okay, where are my strengths? Be honest with your strengths. I don't think it's pride or arrogance to say that you're really good at a particular skill, but it's also really, really important to admit whenever you have shortcomings, right? And then confirmation bias, it's kind of related in the sense that whenever we're investigating things, confirmation bias says that we first and foremost try to look for the information that prove us right. Okay. So if you are Googling your symptoms, you are not necessarily Googling things that, so like, stomach or whatever. All roads on WebMD tend to end in cancer. Unfortunately. But, and so it can kind of lead to panic. Or if we're looking for like a political thing, very often what we're doing is we're not Googling the views of our opponents. We're Googling support for our particular perspective. Whereas in a properly constructed scientific approach to knowledge, the scientific method, or a properly constructed philosophical argument, or a properly constructed persuasive paper or nonfiction piece of research, one of the things that you do spend time doing is positioning your own position, your own thesis, your own theory against competitions, because it is incredibly rare that we are saying something that people have never thought anything about. Very often, whenever we're saying things in a context. Someone has at least given some indication of the phenomenon, right? Now, sometimes there are novel ideas. And so the idea of confirmation bias is ideally to remind us to do our due diligence and to see if other people have said the thing better than us, or if maybe we should change our mind about things. Because when we're operating in that automatic, sort of quick, dirty, heuristic, autopilot kind of way, we just look for confirmation that what we're doing is okay. That might not be the most efficient way of doing things, might not be the most accurate. It might lead to a lot of social harms. Sometimes what we want to do is slow down and look for information that might disprove us and might lead to more optimal long-term outcomes or more just outcomes in our communities or whatever else it is. So confirmation bias is something that we try to avoid. Okay. Now we're going to kind of get into the formal stuff of the arguments. And so I only teach a limited number of argument forms. If you take a proper logic course, you will learn about all of the connectives and how they're defined, etc. But I think that 3 argument forms especially need to be talked about. And this one is, what is the difference between modus ponens and modus tollens? What's the difference between modus ponens and modus tollens? So these start with conditionals, and conditionals always have an if part and a then part. The if part of the statement is the antecedent. The then part is the consequent. Now, in English, the if can come before or after. It just kind of depends on how we want to do it. But the part of the sentence that is connected to the if is always the antecedent. The other part is the consequent. The antecedent is the part that comes before logically. The consequent is the consequent that follows from the antecedent, okay? And so both modus ponens and modus tollens have the same exact first premise in the sense that they both start with a conditional. If A, then B. If A, then B. But with modus ponens, and I think this is the one that most people kind of have a conceptual grasp of, we get the antecedent, we get the A, so we logically conclude that we get B. That is a valid argument. That is an argument that you will see all over the place. Now, the conditional only goes from the antecedent to the consequent. It does not go the other way. So there is a fallacy, a formal fallacy called affirming the consequent, where it said, if A, then B, B, and then the fallacy is to conclude A. The conditional does not work that way. Modus ponens is the valid way of deducing something in this case. If A, then B, you get the antecedent, so you get the consequent. You get A, so you get B. Modus tollens is a way of using negation to maybe go in the other direction, okay? So it starts out with the hypothetical if A, then B. Then the second premise is not B, so you do not have the consequent. And the conclusion is, so you do not have the antecedent, you do not have what leads to that consequent. So if A, then B, not B, so not A. Okay? So that's the differentiation. There are probably a lot of examples. I've given examples on this channel as well, so I'm not going to go over it too much, but that is the big difference between modus ponens and modus tollens. Okay. The other one is this. What is a disjunctive syllogism? I sometimes in my classes call it process of elimination because I think it's a completely natural way of arguing. But what is a disjunctive syllogism? Or maybe we could call it a dilemma or process of elimination. It is this argument form. So basically, premise one will lay out the options, A or B. And because we know that disjunctions, at least one side has to be true, if we disprove one of the two options, we know that it has to be the other one. So disjunctive syllogisms all take the form of this, A or B, not A or not one of the options, so B. Or A or B, not B, so A. But the tricky thing here is you always have to make sure, especially in rhetorical or real life sort of context, that if someone is trying to run a disjunctive syllogism or a dilemma or a process of elimination, that you haven't set up false dilemmas in premise number one, that you actually have all of the live options on the table. There's a way in which you can manipulate the argument by not giving all of the live options. Okay. We talked about Aristotle's rhetoric. This question is, what are the three aspects of Aristotle's rhetoric? What are the three aspects of Aristotle's rhetoric? Okay. And it is ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos in the sense of it focuses on the speaker. Anytime that there's an argument or someone talking about things and you want to come off as credible as possible, in certain ways it can come off as an appeal to authority. Now, sometimes this is okay. So if someone is giving a talk about arthritis as a result of playing soccer your whole life, and it turns out that that person is a physician with a background in rheumatology, or maybe they're an osteopathic surgeon or something like that. Like they understand how the bones and tendons and everything work. That is a very relevant authority to appeal to. That's kind of that person's expertise. Now, it would be wrong to, for example, say that because someone is a tech billionaire and has a lot of money, that they suddenly have a lot of really great solutions to political problems. So the authority that you're appealing to there, having a lot of money and being a really successful tech financier, has actually nothing to do with politics or thinking through systemic issues or thinking through something like justice. Turns out those domains aren't related. So if you're appealing to that kind of authority in that context, it doesn't work. So ethos is about making yourself appear credible. Sometimes this can happen by appearance, by accent, by the way that we talk. Maybe we code switch. We don't talk with our audience the way that we talk with our friends, or if we're talking to our friends, we talk with them like our friends, not just like we would talk to someone at our restaurant gig, or whatever else, or customer service voice. So ethos is all about speaker credibility. Pathos is about the audience. If you're giving a speech or if you're talking about something, trying to convince someone of something, you have to be aware of their minds. You have to be aware of the emotions that you're invoking or that you're evoking from them, in them. I'm not sure what preposition to use there. And so the idea here is that if you want your position to seem good, and if you want for there maybe to be a call for action at the very end, what you probably want to do is evoke emotion. You want your audience to feel good about the good elements that you're bringing up. You want your audience to feel bad about bad things. So infomercials or charity things. You have like a really sad song playing to really impoverished people, or abused and neglected animals, or people with terminal illnesses, or something like that. The idea is that the music and the context is trying to evoke your sympathy. Or maybe it's patriotic and it's celebratory. You evoke that sort of emotion. Or maybe it's a celebration. You evoke that sort of emotion. So the idea is that you want to be aware of your audience, you want to be aware of how they're going to react, and you want to use their reactions to respond well to the right kinds of things. Now again, this can be used in really bad ways because we can certainly exploit emotions. We can exploit context to make bad things seem good. So really good spin doctors, for example, who can spin news, or PR firms who can make bad things seem okay, or we can make good things seem bad. So in politics, there are sometimes really good ideas for legislation, or maybe stopping aggression in a war, or maybe opening up economic policies for taxing people with a lot of money to, for example, provide better hospitals or better public schools or something like that. And certain people will make that sound like a bad thing potentially. Now, politics is complicated. That's why I'm not giving specific examples. But the idea is that if you know how your audience is going to react, you can use key words to make them feel in opposition or in favor of whatever thing you're talking about. And then lastly is logos. And logos is related to logic, but it's related to the context of the speech. So ethos, the speaker; pathos, the audience and their emotions, so authority, emotions; and then logos is the content of the speech, the words that I'm saying. What conclusion am I trying to get you to believe? And have I provided support or evidence to get you to believe that particular conclusion? Now, the reason that we talk about these in a critical thinking class is because philosophers and a lot of academics very often focus on the logic. But if you want to interact with people who are anything other than robots, you need to keep in mind the ethos and the pathos, because it is really, really, really important to be able to present your argument in a way that your audience understands. And even if you are talking to someone, maybe especially if you are talking to someone who has a different worldview than you, who disagrees with you, one of the elements of rhetoric that it's going to always emphasize by thinking about pathos, by thinking about your ethos, your credibility, is you try to find things that both of you agree with, and you try to show why that agreement should lead to whatever conclusion that you're dealing with. You don't just bash people over the head with reasons. To a certain extent, that's kind of what the Gish Gallop was, where someone just lets a deluge of information go. What you do is you find the reasons that your opponent believes, and you show why that leads to the conclusion that you want them to believe. Okay, so that's it. And then lastly And it's certainly not the least. Last but not least, what is the principle of charity? And I think this is really important. So, what is the principle of charity? And the principle of charity, at least for my class, I kind of described it in two ways, or as having two components. First of all, assume that your opponent is rational. So like if they're making mistakes, they're not maybe intending to deceive you. They just like forgot to say something. So assume that they're rational, assume that they're trying to get at the truth. And then what you want to do is, especially in a debate, so where you disagree with someone and they disagree with you and you're arguing two different points, you want to be able to reconstruct their argument accurately. You want to be able to reconstruct their argument accurately. Now, we learned about two fallacies that are kind of the polar opposites with respect to this. The most common one is the straw man fallacy, and the straw man fallacy is the idea that we reconstruct an arguments from our opponent in as weak a way as possible so that it's easy to defeat. So, for example, calling people who are okay with medical access to abortion, calling them baby killers, and people who are opposed to medical access to abortion, calling them Bible thumpers. Is it short? Is it pithy? Is it easy to understand? Does it signal that you don't like your opponent? Yeah, sure. But does it really get to the core ideas of what's going on in that debate? And the answer is almost certainly not. So, whenever you rely on straw men, so a lack of charity, you just don't get at the real issues. And that's what makes it a fallacy. But on the other hand, especially if we're dealing with our own arguments or if we're dealing with the arguments of our friends or people who are, maybe intellectually related to us in a certain way, we can steel man or we can iron man them, where the idea is that we make their arguments maybe so strong or so airtight, and maybe they didn't argue those things in the first place. We've been too sympathetic. Now, it's much rarer that we steel man a person's argument, but it happens occasionally. And the last note on this slide is this only works in good faith arguments. You should not spend your time arguing with someone who is not open to changing their mind, who is not open to other evidence. They're like it's just a waste of time. It's a waste of effort. Now you might make small efforts here and there, okay, but you have to be strategic. This charity really only extends in certain contexts. At least that's sort of my advice. Now, generally speaking, probably better to bias in the direction of charity than hostility or just like not wanting to get into things with certain people. But it is really important to say that this only counts in good faith arguments. If someone is so riled up about an issue that they're not going to listen, and this happens all over the political spectrum, by the way, it's not just one side or the other. You just kind of have to read the room. Sometimes when people are talking about politics or whatever else, they're venting or they are confessing what their beliefs are. They are not asking for a debate. So maybe you could listen, but you're probably not going to be able to convince people in all contexts. So the principle of charity is especially in a context where there's multiple views kind of happening and where people are open to having a conversation with one another, exchanging reasons, maybe changing elements of their position. Okay. So, question is, how did you do? Were you able to answer all of those questions? Did you have all of those concepts? If so, you could probably pass my class. So you watched those videos really well, or you know logic and rhetoric really well, even though there's a lot more, right? I just try and boil things down to these concepts because I think these are the core ones. And in my experience, one of the tests that I would use is, so if someone walked into my class off the streets, they shouldn't necessarily be able to pass my exam, right? Or if a student walked in from a different class who hadn't taken my class, they shouldn't necessarily be able to pass my exam. And it's not because it's hard, it's because there are concepts that we teach in this class, and that's what it means to take a class. But at the end of the semester, all of my students should be able to answer these questions. And I don't do multiple choice. I don't do fill in the blank or anything like that. I do basically short answer because I want my students to be able to have these ideas in their head ready to be used. So in this class, basically at this point, what we do then is we use these things to analyze stuff. As I said, Amanda Montell's cultish, and then Rebecca Roach's For Fuck's Sake about curse words. There's some other lessons that I've considered doing. For example, Candice Delmas's A Duty to Resist. So many cool things where you can tie it to contemporary philosophy and talk about a bunch of stuff that happens. Lovell Anderson has these really amazing pieces on racist humor and kind of like what makes racist humor harmful. So a lot of cool connections that philosophers can make, and I'm happy to give recommendations in the comments, or if you see me in office hours or whatever else. I hope you've enjoyed this series of videos, and it maybe as the occasion arises, I will make more. But for now, this concludes Critical Thinking Basics. See you next time.